Estoy en conexión con Owen Jones. Owen, good morning. Thank you for being with us today.
It's a big honor. How you doing?
It's great. We are talking about Venezuela, as it's obvious, but I would like to ask you about these guidelines, this memo, because it's very important. You posted on your social media that the BBC memo outlines some guidelines for journalists when reporting on the events of January the 3rd. I would like you to elaborate on these guidelines and ask you if is it common to have guidelines like this to journalists?
Well, this was leaked to me from the BBC, and it says that BBC journalists must adhere to these rules. And the BBC has editorial guidelines. That's perfectly reasonable. You standardise in its reporting how it talks about events, issues. That part's fine. But what this does is it says to ensure clarity and consistency in our reporting, please follow these guidelines when describing the recent events in Venezuela. It says if you're discussing as a journalist what the US themselves describe themselves as doing, you can use captured. But then they say, for our own reporting, say seized, avoid using kidnapped. Now, I would note Donald Trump himself, when he was asked by a journalist who said that interim Venezuelan President Delcy Rodriguez said that Maduro was kidnapped, Trump himself responded, it's all right, it's not a bad term. So even Donald Trump himself, the US president, who kidnapped, and we should be clear, Maduro was kidnapped, he said that he was kidnapped. BBC journalists are banned from saying kidnapped. Seized, I mean, the word seized is what you might expect for stolen goods, drugs for that matter. Seized is used in that kind of reporting. Seized is not used to describe what happens here, which is a kidnapping. And I have to say, if this was Russia and Zelensky, for example, in Ukraine, they would say kidnapped. And I can be absolutely clear, the BBC would say kidnapped in those circumstances.
That's very important because, Owen, you have been very critical of the BBC's role in its coverage of the genocide against Palestinian people, for example. So would you say that these lines of action continue the BBC's pattern of providing biased information? Would you say that there is a pattern, a media pattern at this moment, first about the genocide against Palestinian people and now against Nicolás Maduro and whatever is happening in Venezuela?
Yes, it's absolutely part of the same problem. The BBC's coverage of Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people is a disgrace. It whitewashed what Israel did. It would frame its reports around official Israeli statements, even though it's just a fact that Israel lies over and over again. That's just a fact. It would, ignore Palestinian voices and erase them. It would erase atrocities. It would state actual facts, for example, a hospital being attacked as though that was a matter of opinion. We could go on. I mean, just to continue the theme, this morning on the BBC, they were talking about the US plans to invade Greenland. And it's important I say that, invade Greenland. This is how they described it. Using the American military to acquire Greenland. The White House says it's one of the options Trump and his team are discussing. And the headline at the bottom was US Greenland plans. Can you imagine this was Russia and Estonia, for example? Imagine the Russian state was saying that they were planning on using the military to invade and annex Estonia. Would the BBC say using the Russian military to acquire Estonia? Vladimir Putin and his team say they're discussing that as an option. Of course they wouldn't. They would say Estonia, that Russia is threatening to invade Estonia. What the BBC does, so we're clear, is it echoes Western foreign policy establishment narratives. That's what the BBC does. It echoes the priorities and positions of the British establishment. So when it comes to dictatorships which are supportive of the West, like Saudi Arabia, it won't discuss it in those terms. It won't call it a dictatorship. But if it's an enemy of the West, then it will frame it in those terms. So all of the BBC's coverage reflects what is seen as the prevailing common sense within the British establishment when it comes to Western foreign policy.
Would you say we are talking about propaganda, Owen? Would you use that word?
Of course it's propaganda. I mean, what the BBC are doing is essentially covering for the foreign policy aims and goals of the West. I mean, that's what they've always done, and we've seen it again. You know, I mean, in the run up to the Iraq War, you know, the illegal invasion of the Iraq War, you know, the BBC actually then, I mean, it was quite interesting. You did get some scrutiny of the BBC's of the government's plans, and then the BBC top brass were forced to resign afterwards. I mean, what happened in Britain, as in other countries, the only people who resigned were the people who were seen as too critical of the Iraq War. And, you know, even then their coverage was still very problematic of the Iraq War. But since then, it's made them more cowed, because the BBC is supposed to be, it's a public broadcaster, but, you know, and it's supposed to be independent of the government, but the government has so much control over the BBC. It determines its funding, it appoints people onto its board. The board is full of these establishment types. I mean, at the top of the BBC at the moment, you've got someone who took over a newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, which, to be clear, has a militant pro-Israel bias that many Jewish Brits find offensive. And he's at the top of there in terms of looking at complaints about BBC coverage. You know, he's the former spokesperson to the Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, and he sits at the very top of the BBC determining its editorial guidelines and complaints to do with it. So the BBC, yes, it spreads, you know, propaganda in the service of Western foreign policy ends. And we've seen that, as I've said, you know, big, major foreign policy crises, it will just follow the official narrative. And BBC journalists are angry about this. I mean, I've covered the revolt of BBC journalists against their coverage of Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people, because it was just so unbelievably outrageous. There was just, you know, no attempt to show, you know, I mean, again, the fact there's a consensus of genocide scholars who say it's genocide, that a UN independent report said it's genocide, the fact that the International Criminal Court, with Britain as a member founding state, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants, you know, just framing it on the terms of this is what the consensus of the experts and relevant organizations say. But the BBC doesn't do that. It treats Israel's official position as credible in a way they would never do with Russia. You know, they wouldn't just regurgitate what Russian claims are and treat them as credible. So they end up spreading and treating, in the case of Israel, we saw they take what are obvious lies and present them as credible. What that does in practice is normalize propaganda in the service of, in that case, genocide.
Talk about propaganda and use that word, I believe. Owen, I just have one last question, because Gaza is said to be a turning point. I do believe it was a turning point, not only in terms of what was politically permissible, but also what was permissible used by the media powers, like we are talking about the BBC. What can we do as journalists? Because you were saying that you as a journalist was angry about this. We're angry about this. So what can we do as journalists, and what can we do as consumers of information as well?
Well, we can build our own media outlets. That's what you're doing. It's very important that we build our own ecosystem. That also puts pressure on other established outlets. They're much weaker than they were. I mean, it used to be the case in Britain, you had BBC and ITV, basically, and then Sky News. You know, that's how people, and then the newspapers. But now you get a much broader range of voices. There's problems with that as well, because you now have lots of right-wing propaganda outlets, far-right propaganda outlets spreading disinformation, misinformation. So there's a downside. But we need to democratize the media. We need to build our own platforms and put pressure on them. Today, I'm getting people to complain to the BBC about the way they're talking about the invasion of Greenland. We have forced them on Israel and Gaza in some cases to retreat. But we've got to build a media ecosystem that isn't either run by the establishment, as the BBC is, or by private business people who treat these media outlets as their playthings to further their own political goals in favour of a status quo they profit and benefit from. So it's up to us. We've got to do that. And that's what you're doing, which is great to see.
And that's what you're doing as well. We know that. We know that for sure. Owen Jones, thank you for being with us this morning and for the job you're doing. I do believe that's very important and that it's an example at this moment and this time. Hope to see you soon again.
Will do. Take care. Right back at you.